You get into bed at a reasonable hour, lights off, phone away, doing everything you think you're supposed to do, and instead of drifting off, you lie there. You kick one leg out from under the covers because you feel overheated, then pull it back in a few minutes later because now you're cold. You flip the pillow to the cool side. You check the clock, do the math on how many hours of sleep you'll get if you fall asleep right now, and that math itself keeps you awake another 20 minutes. You blame the coffee you had at 2 p.m., or the stress from work, or just being someone who's never been a great sleeper. I'm not going to tell you to cut caffeine earlier or meditate before bed, because you've probably tried some version of that already and it barely moved the needle. The actual reason you're lying there restless has almost nothing to do with your mind racing and almost everything to do with a temperature change that was supposed to be happening quietly inside your body right around now. One specific physiological event your brain is genuinely waiting for before it will let you drop into deep sleep, and for a lot of people past a certain age, that event simply isn't happening cleanly anymore. Before I explain exactly what that temperature change is and how to deliberately trigger it, I want to show you the research behind it, because if I just said your body needs to cool down to fall asleep, you'd assume that was an oversimplified guess. It isn't a guess. It's one of the more precisely mapped mechanisms in modern sleep science, and once you understand it, you're going to look at your own bedtime routine, and possibly your own socks, completely differently. The drop nobody explains deep inside your brain, your circadian system doesn't just control when you feel sleepy. It also controls a tightly scheduled daily rhythm in your core body temperature, the internal temperature of your organs and blood, as distinct from the temperature of your skin. In a person on a healthy sleep schedule, core temperature peaks in the early evening, then begins declining, dropping by roughly 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the following hours, reaching its lowest point somewhere in the early hours of the morning before climbing back up ahead of your natural wake time. That evening decline isn't incidental to falling asleep. Researchers studying thermoregulation and sleep have found it's one of the most reliable physiological predictors of when sleep onset actually happens, more predictive in some studies than how tired a person reports feeling. A Swiss researcher named Kurt Crouchy spent much of his career mapping exactly how this temperature drop gets executed at a mechanical level, and what he found reshaped how sleep scientists think about the whole process. The core temperature decline isn't primarily driven by your body simply generating less heat internally. It's driven by a rapid increase in blood flow to your hands and feet, through specialized blood vessel structures called arteriovenous anastomosis concentrated almost exclusively in your palms, soles, and fingertips, structures whose entire function is dumping heat from your body's core out through the skin surface of your extremities. When those vessels open up in the evening, warm blood rushes out to your hands and feet, your skin there measurably warms up, and your core, having just released a meaningful amount of its heat through that surface, cools down as a direct result. Crouch's research, published in a landmark 1999 paper in the journal Nature, found that the single strongest predictor of how quickly someone would fall asleep wasn't their core temperature in isolation, and it wasn't their skin temperature in isolation. It was the gradient between the two, how much warmer their hands and feet had gotten relative to their core. The bigger and faster that gradient opened up, the faster sleep onset followed, almost as if the two were mechanically locked together. Here's the finding that should genuinely surprise you, because it runs against what most people assume. A team of researchers led by Shahab Hagia pulled together years of research on passive body heating before bed, warm baths and showers taken an hour or two before sleep, and published a meta-analysis in 2019 examining the combined results across dozens of studies. The consistent finding was that a warm bath or shower, water temperature somewhere around 104 to 109 degrees Fahrenheit, taken 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, meaningfully shortened how long it took people to fall asleep, with the average improvement landing somewhere around 10 minutes faster sleep onset compared to no bath at all, alongside improvements in reported sleep quality. Warming yourself up deliberately, on purpose, close to bedtime, made you fall asleep faster. Not despite the temperature drop your body needed. Because of it. A warm bath dilates those same peripheral blood vessels artificially, kickstarting the exact heat-dumping process your circadian rhythm was already trying to initiate on its own, and the compensatory drop in core temperature that follows getting out of a warm bath happens faster and more sharply than the drop your body would have produced entirely on its own, on its usual gradual schedule. Hold those two findings side by side. Sleep onset is most reliably predicted not by how tired you feel but by how quickly heat moves out through your hands and feet, and deliberately warming yourself up before bed accelerates that exact process rather than working against it. Those two facts sitting together should feel strange, the same way it felt strange that a valve losing tone could explain heartburn that got blamed on dinner, or that a gradually stiffening ankle could show up in a statistic about lifespan. It isn't that your body simply needs to cool down passively while you wait around for it to happen. It's that a specific, measurable, engineered heat transfer system exists in your hands and feet for exactly this purpose, and for a meaningful share of adults, particularly past midlife, that system has gotten noticeably less efficient at doing its job on schedule. It's not about getting cold. It's about dumping heat efficiently. Here's the reframe I need you to sit with, because it corrects a genuinely common misunderstanding that this title itself could accidentally reinforce if I let it. It's not that your bedroom needs to feel cold, or that you personally need to feel cold, in order to fall asleep well. What actually matters is how efficiently your body can move heat from your core out to your skin's surface and off into the surrounding air, and a body that's struggling to dump heat efficiently can feel simultaneously too warm and unable to properly cool down at the same time, which is exactly the restless, kick the covers off then pull them back on sensation so many people experience lying awake. Treating the goal as simply get cold and cranking the air conditioning down aggressively can actually work against you, because if your skin gets too cold too fast, particularly on your hands and feet, those peripheral blood vessels can constrict defensively to conserve heat rather than staying open to release it, shutting down the exact mechanism you were trying to encourage. Let's walk through the mechanics of how this heat transfer system is actually supposed to work, because once you see it clearly, the warm bath finding stops feeling counterintuitive and starts making complete sense. Think of your circulatory system as having two very different jobs depending on the time of day. During waking hours, particularly under stress or cold exposure, blood flow to your hands and feet constricts, keeping warm blood concentrated around your vital organs, the same protective response that makes your fingers go cold when you're anxious or chilly. In the evening, as your circadian rhythm shifts toward sleep preparation and melatonin begins rising, that pattern reverses. Melatonin itself directly promotes dilation of those same peripheral blood vessels, essentially handing your body a hormonal green light to open the valves and let warm core blood flow out to the skin surface of your hands and feet, where it can radiate heat away into the surrounding air far more efficiently than it could from deep inside your torso. Your palms and soles are specifically built for this job, carrying a much higher density of those specialized heat-dumping vessels than almost anywhere else on your body, which is exactly why measuring hand and foot temperature turns out to be such a precise predictor of how close someone is to falling asleep. Warm hands and feet in the evening aren't a coincidence or a comfort preference. They're the visible surface signature of your body successfully executing the internal cooling process that sleep onset depends on. Why this system loses efficiency? This isn't a system that stays equally sharp across your entire adult life, and it isn't purely a matter of bad luck when it starts misfiring. There are a small number of specific, well-documented reasons this heat-dumping process gets less efficient over time, and once you see them laid out, you'll likely recognize your own nights in more than one. The first is a genuine age-related decline in peripheral vasodilation capacity itself. Research on thermoregulation across the adult lifespan has consistently found that the blood vessels responsible for this exact heat-dumping response become somewhat less responsive with age, opening less fully and less quickly in response to the same evening signal that used to trigger a robust reaction reliably in earlier decades. It's a similar broad pattern to the connective tissue and smooth muscle changes discussed elsewhere on this channel, tissue that once responded briskly to a signal gradually becoming a bit more sluggish about answering it, without any single dramatic moment marking exactly when the change occurred. The second is evening light exposure, which interferes with the hormonal trigger for this entire process rather than the vessels themselves. Bright light in the hours before bed, particularly the blue-shifted light emitted by phones, tablets, and overhead LED lighting, suppresses melatonin release, and because melatonin is the specific hormonal signal driving that peripheral vasodilation, a delayed or blunted melatonin rise means a delayed or blunted vasodilation response too. You're not just staying more alert under bright evening light. You're keeping the exact valve that's supposed to open and dump heat sitting shut for longer than your circadian rhythm actually intended. The third is something almost nobody connects to sleep at all: cold hands and feet from reduced baseline circulation, which becomes more common with age. This one is genuinely counterintuitive, so it's worth sitting with directly. If your hands and feet are already running cold going into the evening, whether from reduced circulation, sitting still for hours, or a chilly house, those peripheral vessels have less warm blood available to dump heat with even once melatonin does successfully signal them to open, and cold extremities can also trigger a competing reflex that keeps those same vessels partially constricted to protect against further heat loss, working directly against the dilation your sleep onset depends on. Counterintuitively, the person whose feet feel cold at bedtime is very often the person whose core-to-skin heat transfer is working the worst, not the person who simply runs a naturally cooler body temperature. Stack those three things together: blood vessels that respond somewhat less briskly to the evening signal than they used to, a melatonin trigger arriving late or blunted because of evening light exposure, and cold baseline hands and feet that struggle to dump heat even once the signal does arrive, and you get exactly the pattern so many people describe without ever connecting it to a single underlying mechanism: lying in bed feeling simultaneously warm and restless and unable to properly settle night after night, and quietly assuming that simply what sleep has become for them as they've gotten older. None of these three factors requires the others to be present in order to disrupt the process, which is part of why the problem shows up so differently from person to person. Someone with naturally efficient circulation but a habit of scrolling on a bright phone screen until the moment they turn the lights off is fighting the melatonin half of the equation almost entirely on its own. Someone with genuinely cold hands and feet from reduced circulation, even in an otherwise dark, screen-free bedroom, is fighting the vessel responsiveness half instead. Most people past midlife are dealing with some combination of all three at once, which is exactly why a single isolated fix, cutting caffeine, or trying meditation, on its own so often falls short of actually solving it. Why this actually matters beyond one restless night. I want to walk through the real chain of consequences here honestly, because what's at stake extends well beyond how long it takes you to drift off. The temperature drop that opens the door to sleep onset doesn't stop mattering once you're actually asleep. The depth and duration of deep, slow-wave sleep, the stage most closely tied to physical restoration, has been linked in research to the same core temperature trajectory, with a faster, more complete evening decline associated with more time spent in that deeper stage during the first sleep cycle of the night, which tends to be when the largest share of a night's total deep sleep occurs. Deep sleep is when the pituitary gland releases the largest pulse of growth hormone of the entire day, a hormone genuinely involved in tissue repair. And it's also the sleep stage most closely associated with what researchers call the glymphatic system, a recently mapped waste clearance process that becomes significantly more active during deep sleep, helping flush metabolic byproducts, including proteins associated with neurodegenerative conditions, out of brain tissue. A temperature drop that arrives late, blunted, or incomplete doesn't just delay when you fall asleep. It plausibly shortchanges the depth of the sleep stage, doing some of the most physically restorative work of the entire night. There's also a compounding piece worth naming honestly. Difficulty falling asleep itself tends to generate its own low-grade stress response, cortisol and sympathetic nervous system activity both rising modestly the longer someone lies awake anxious about not sleeping, and that stress response directly works against the peripheral vasodilation this whole process depends on, since acute stress is one of the most reliable triggers for constricting blood flow to the extremities rather than opening it up. A restless night driven by inefficient heat dumping can quietly create the exact physiological state that makes efficient heat dumping even harder to achieve, a loop that tends to compound across consecutive rough nights rather than resolving on its own. This is also part of why so many people report that their sleep troubles seem to arrive in stretches rather than isolated bad nights. One night of blunted heat dumping produces one night of restless, fragmented sleep. That restless night raises next-day stress hormone levels somewhat, which in turn keeps peripheral vessels slightly more constricted the following evening than they otherwise would have been, making the next attempt at cooling down for sleep start from a worse baseline than the night before. Left alone, that pattern can genuinely spiral across a week or two, which is exactly the kind of stretch that gets people reaching for the label chronic insomnia when what's actually underneath it, for a meaningful share of cases, is a thermoregulatory loop that never got interrupted with a deliberate intervention. What actually forces this drop? Here's where I need to be direct, the same way I've been through this entire video. You cannot simply will your peripheral blood vessels to dilate through effort or willpower. But you can deliberately trigger the exact mechanism responsible, and the research on how to do that is fairly specific. The single most effective change, directly supported by the Hagia meta-analysis discussed earlier, is a warm bath or shower, water temperature somewhere in the range of 104 to 109 degrees Fahrenheit, taken 1 to 2 hours before your intended bedtime, for around 10 minutes. The timing matters as much as the temperature. Taken too close to actually getting into bed, you're still in the warming phase and haven't given your body time to execute the compensatory drop yet. Taken with enough of a gap beforehand, you get out of the bath with your peripheral vessels already fully dilated, your core actively shedding heat through your skin, and you climb into bed right as that compensatory core temperature drop is accelerating toward its steepest point, precisely the window sleep onset research keeps identifying as optimal. Warming your feet specifically, even without a full bath, directly targets Crouch's core finding about the skin-to-core gradient. Wearing socks to bed or using a heating pad on your feet briefly before sleep is one of the more consistently supported individual interventions in sleep research, specifically for people who describe chronically cold feet at bedtime, because it addresses the exact bottleneck identified above, giving those heat-dumping vessels warm blood to actually work with rather than asking them to open onto an already cold periphery. Keeping the bedroom itself on the cooler side, generally somewhere around 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, still matters, but for a more specific reason than simply cold rooms help sleep. A cooler ambient environment increases the temperature gradient between your now warmed skin and the surrounding air, allowing the heat your dilated vessels are dumping to actually radiate away efficiently rather than getting trapped in an overly warm room, which would blunt the very core temperature drop you just worked to accelerate. And protecting the evening hours from bright light in the last hour or two before bed supports the melatonin signal that triggers this entire cascade in the first place, giving that hormonal green light a chance to arrive on schedule rather than delayed by a bright screen a few inches from your face. The myth worth killing here: you've probably heard the common advice that you should avoid anything warming before bed, cold showers only, keep the whole body cool at all costs, because heat supposedly keeps you awake. That advice gets the direction backward for the specific window right before sleep. Chronic overheating throughout the night, a room kept too warm with too many blankets trapping heat against skin that's trying to radiate it away, genuinely does disrupt sleep, and that's the finding this myth is loosely based on. But a deliberate, time-limited warm exposure taken 1 to 2 hours before bed isn't the same thing at all. It's priming the exact system responsible for the compensatory cooling that follows, and the research consistently shows it speeds up sleep onset rather than delaying it. The confusion comes from conflating being warm while trying to sleep, which is genuinely disruptive, with being warm briefly beforehand in a way that accelerates the cooling your body needs once you actually get into bed. Being honest about the limits here, I don't want to oversell this, because doing so would undercut everything true I've said so far. A warm bath and warm socks are not a treatment for diagnosed insomnia, sleep apnea, or other clinical sleep disorders, and if you're dealing with chronic, severe difficulty sleeping, that's genuinely worth bringing to a doctor rather than addressing with a bedtime routine alone. If you have a circulatory condition like Raynaud's phenomenon or diabetes-related circulation concerns, talk to your doctor before making significant changes to how you warm your extremities, since those conditions can change how your body responds to both warming and cooling. This video is about supporting a normal, healthy thermoregulatory process that modern habits and ordinary aging tend to quietly blunt, not about replacing medical evaluation for a genuine sleep disorder. Coming back to that restless bed, think back to that moment kicking one leg out from under the covers, then pulling it back in a few minutes later, unable to settle into either temperature. It was never really about the room being wrong or your mind racing too much to switch off. It was a specific heat transfer system in your hands and feet, engineered to open on schedule every single evening of your life, arriving a little late, a little blunted, or working against a periphery that was already too cold to dump heat with effectively. Picture what's actually on the other side of getting this system working properly again. It isn't just falling asleep a few minutes faster. It's a deeper, more complete stretch of the restorative sleep stage your body relies on for genuine physical repair and overnight waste clearance, night after night, instead of a shallower, more fragmented version of it. It's warm feet under the covers doing exactly the specific job they were built for, rather than sitting cold and quietly working against the very process you're lying there waiting for. The system was never broken beyond repair. It just needed a clearer signal and a warmer starting point than modern evenings, bright screens, cool feet, and rooms held at the wrong temperature tend to give it. Now you know exactly what your body is waiting for before it lets you drop into deep sleep, and exactly how to give it that signal on purpose.